Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome to the InfoMullet. My name is Timothy Clancy. I'm your chief mulleteer. Tonight, Facebook Live coronavirus, ask me anything. And we got a lot of topics to go over tonight. And it's going to be kind of, I hate to say that this is the one where I prepare your mental model, but every week and every 3 days, I feel like I'm trying to prepare people on the mental model of what's to come. And we're going to spend some time on that because unfortunately the news is not getting better, and it's actually going to get a lot worse. And what we had feared would happen is now happening. So what we've talked about for the last 2 weeks on the InfoMullet for sort of forecast has now begun to manifest materially. And we're going to go through that and sort of take it in stages so that hopefully you're understanding what's happening, why it's happening, why the data is looking as it is, even as the data begins to diverge from the material conditions on the ground, and specifically in New York City. So before we get to that, good to see you, Mike, Tyson, Jennifer. Good to see you. So we're going to begin with why we pulled the state information. So for those of you who watch the InfoMullet, we had a state level chart that we were using state level reporting for about a week. And we knew all along that the confirmed cases in the state level charts were lower than the actual. But it was useful in a sense in that it still showed the general behavior of outbreak. But in the middle of the week on Wednesday, we pulled all state level reporting. And I know some folks were using it to sort of keep track of what was going on, and we kind of left them blind. So I actually wanted to walk through why we did that, because this is important not just in the United States, but around the world. And it has to do with how daily testing levels and the growth in testing and the availability or failure to be able to test actually has an impact on the data we see. So from a system standpoint, a system structure, there's two things to keep in mind. There's the state of the system, which is the world and the actual number of infected and the people that are experiencing difficulties and going into hospitals. That is the actual system, but we can't see that. We don't know that. We can only know the system through information we get, and the information sometimes has discrepancies in it that can create inaccurate understanding of what's going on in the systems. And this is a good example where that's happened. So I want to share with you a screen a chart that is put together by Calculated Risk Blog. And this chart is very useful because it shows two pieces of important information. On the left is the vertical axis on the left is the number of tests that are being run daily. And this has been an important number, because we can all say, well, South Korea had 10,000 tests a day and we didn't, but they really began ramping up the tests per day. And you can see in the blue that it actually does scale up pretty nicely through. I mean, obviously in March, we were way under from where we should have been. If South Korea is doing 10,000 a day, you can see here, even up to March 9th, we're doing barely 1,100. That is way too few, but it was increasing as we were ramping up the testing capability. And this, if you were looking at our charts, you were seeing that the confirmed were growing, and this led to an understanding that this is going to be a risk for all states. But then something happened here around March 27th, and this is that power of a doubling. The virus is doubling. Very few things on the planet double as quickly as viruses and viral contagions. Certainly not human productions and ability to manufacture. So even though we went from 1,000, we increased this by 100-fold. In 20 days, we went from 1,100 to about 100,000. But at that same time, the virus is doubling. And at that point, we stalled out. And you can see in this blue line where for almost a week here, we were trading in a range of, call it 95 to 113,000. And that means our productive capacity and the ability to administer tests flattened. And it flattened at a time that the COVID-19 virus was still expanding. And when that happens, when you have a measure that's growing and your tests to discover it are flattening, and you have a large number, what it's going to look like in the information is a declining growth rate. What I mean by that is if you have 100,000 cases and you're expecting it to double in 3 days, you have to be able to test another doubling in effect of those cases to catch that growth. If you don't, it'll look like the growth is declining. And I think this is happening not just in the US, but in other countries around the world. I'm using US as an example, but I'm going to equip you with the means to check this on other countries, because what you're looking for is not just the daily number, but this right-hand axis here. There's percent positive. This is a rule, a guide we can use to understand, are we testing enough? And it's a simple rule of thumb. It's not a sophisticated measure, but the basic rule of thumb is if you're finding 10% positive or less, you're probably testing enough. If you're finding more than 10% positive, you're probably not testing enough. And the reason this is, it seems kind of counterintuitive, but the reason this is as we run out of tests, we tend to shrink from what might be called a surveillance testing. So surveillance testing is you're testing a large part of the population. You're trying to capture those who are asymptomatic as well as symptomatic. We shift from a surveillance testing to a diagnostic testing. A diagnostic testing is you're entering a hospital because you already don't feel well or are sick. You're showing symptoms. You might be being hospitalized. You've passed, and we're testing to see if the body has the virus. Diagnostic testing shrinks the sample size and biases it to one that is more likely to have it already. And so the positive rate begins increasing. And what you see here on this red line is you see that we go from a 10% positive rate, and we really begin expanding up here to where we're now about at a 25% positive rate. And that's not a good news. Like people like, yay, we're capturing more positives. No, we're capturing more positives because we've shrunk the population we're looking at, and we're kind of testing likely we suspect they're already in, they've got it because they're coming into us for a reason. So even as you see this jump in tests from 113,000 to 140, you can put that in context by looking at the positive rate and saying, it's not going down a lot. It went down a little bit. So as you look around, you could do this at a city level, a state level, a country level. Look at not just the daily number of tests and is it growing, but the rate of positives, and how close is it to 10%? Is it 10% or below, or is it trending up from 10%? And what this looks like, so this is what was going on in the testing, but I described as your testing flattens and your growth increases, you get a false declining rate. This is the daily rate of change that we used at the state level. And these states were identified by Al Jazeera reports, New York Times reports, CDC reports. All 4 of these states on Wednesday were declared to be having active outbreaks. Well, look at the rate of change. On all 4 of them, it's declining. So in theory, we're having an active accelerating outbreak by everything we hear on the ground. But the information flow coming to us because of this gap in testing shows a declining rate. And not only is it declining, look at yellow and blue here, which is Illinois and Florida, right? These are 2 states that have very little in common. Illinois, center Midwest, northern center, Florida, southeast, different environments, different cultures, everything is different. But look at how close they're declining. The peak of the wave, again, back to geometry, eighth grade geometry here, right? An oscillating wave has a peak, which is the high point, a trough, which is the low point, and a period, which is the time it takes to get from 1 to 1. So look at the peak and the troughs and the periods of how closely these line up. These states are actually matching all the way down as they decline. 2 states that should be fairly different are now looking very similar. And that's when you look at these behavior modes and sort of take a system structure view, that's telling you that the information flow in the system is probably being affected not by the reality on the ground, the system state that we want to get, but some exogenous thing like limited testing, batching. They only get tested every so often. They can only report so often. So what we did to fix this is we actually released, here we go, a method. And we talked about this method on the past. And again, props out to the military militia team, Jerry Spalding, Krista Parker, Nicholas Brown. They've been working on this. The method is forget testing, right? Testing is now unreliable. And we can't trust the information we're getting because we still need to do it, but we can't rely on that to know where things are going. What we can know though is deaths. Deaths, unfortunately, are a very good proxy for infections. The way it works like this is fairly simple. You make a few assumptions and you can use some basic algebra with a little calculus and get to an actual infected rate. So all along we've been using confirmed, which we knew was a much lower infected rate. The confirmed cases, but you can actually use those 3 assumptions to get a calculated actual infected. And so what we did is the assumptions are, on average, it takes 20 days to pass after you've gotten sick, and that it ranges from a few hours to 40 days, but 20 is an average according to the research. on average, we're going to say 4% of, for this purposes, and this is not like an actual death rate. This is a calculation parameter we use for the estimate. 4% of all infected will die. And so now we know that if we have 4 people die on H date, which is say today, 20 days ago, that represents 100 infected. And that calculation, we can actually advance each day. There's a new death rate to get a cumulative tracking. And that's what this chart does. So this is the death rate. And I pulled here Michigan. These are the number of deaths that Michigan has had cumulatively. These are all cumulative numbers, right? So as the death rate expands, we actually take the death and go back in time. So all these charts are centered that the first confirmed death happens on day 20. We go back 20 days in time and calculate how many infected there were 20 days prior to the first death. Then we grow that with the death rate. So this yellow bar here is actually, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's a fairly reasonable measure of the number of infected that would be necessary to generate the number of deaths. But that only gets us to 20 days from today, 20 days before today. At that point, we use the calculus forecasting method and we apply one of 3 scenarios. And you can see them here spread out, is feared, hoped, and mid. And what these are is, this is actually here, and I apologize, the colors don't match, bad chart visualization, but we're doing this kind of on the fly. These forecasts is kind of the life cycle of a viral spike. We've been looking at these behaviors for a month now. I'm kind of familiar with what they are. A feared scenario is that the rate of change and growth continues for a period of time and then begins flattening out. A mid or transition point is that flattening out then leads to a decline, and the hoped for behavior is it's a continuous decline. We don't know what's actually going on in the system, so we use all 3 to create a spread, which tells us, very rough approximation, how many actual infected there are in these states relative to the confirmed total we believe. And you can see the gap is very, very large. Now, there's a few things that weight this. We actually take, a little technical, but we take a 7-day moving average of the rate of change at the last calculation. And if that happens to be high, it's going to skew it up a lot. If it happens to be low, it's going to skew it down a lot. We don't have a good answer for that. But we're really trying to show notionally the extent of the actual infected relative to what we think there are now that these tests are sort of failing us. And we can pull up different states. So I'm going to pull up Georgia because I know we got some Georgia folks here, right? Georgia had 1 death for a long time, and you can see here that we kept it at 100, but then it spiked when the Albany cluster came out, and you can see that spike in affected, and that begins accelerating. Again, the yellow is fairly reasonable based off this calculation, and the rest are forecast. But it tells you, this is like what governors need to keep an eye on, is that these totals that are actual infected are much, much higher than the confirmed. And things like keeping the beaches open, which is in Georgia, or the Georgia governor is like, I didn't realize symptomatic people were asymptomatic and carried. You know, they need to get ahead of the game on this and understand that there's a lot more infected running around than we actually realize. Now, these charts, some of these numbers are so large that they sort of imply that tip of the iceberg theory from the Oxford paper, that many of us already have it and very few of us will pass. That's kind of what the spread is designed to do. There's a lot of uncertainty built into that confidence spread to say we don't really know, but it's to give us a notional net level of where we are at states. And let me say hello, Tony, Michael, good to see you. Mike Morrison, Tyson, Susan, Sean, lots of folks, Jody, Johnny, Ishmael. Okay, so I'll get to the questions here now. Let's see if there are questions. So that's why we pulled the states and we've now returned this. Now this calculation is up live. We will continue to tweak it. One thing to know about this, these charts will change every day. Every day there's a new death rate published. These charts will automatically update to reincorporate that into that yellow line, so it'll recalculate, and then those forecasts will automatically, and we're continuing to tweak the forecast a little bit, so don't be surprised if from day to day you see the number change a little bit. Again, these aren't, in systems thinking, we talk about the difference between precision and accuracy, and that's confusing, but accuracy in this sense means a sufficient enough explanation to understand what's going on. Precision is that the number is 27,353 on the dot. In complex systems, it's almost impossible to get precision. What you're looking for is an accurate enough representation to make policy choices on. Let's see here. let's see what some of the questions. Johnny David, nothing is happening except bad news. Numbers mean nothing. This has been here for almost a year. Okay, that's an interesting statement, Johnny. If numbers mean nothing, then how do you know this has been here for a year? Because that implies both numbers in a calendar and numbers in a count. You can't say numbers mean nothing and then use numbers to describe something. So I'll let you get back to that. Kind of, I may be misunderstanding, and if so, I apologize. Susan, good to see you. Oh, I see. Johnny's, yeah, the early numbers are low. The only counting positive tests, which are 80% false positive. Don't delete the numbers when supposedly recovered. So Johnny, we're going to now talk to you as we go into this next section, which is New York City. You no longer need to believe the numbers, Johnny. You can just drive to New York City and start going around on the streets and taking a look around, because what's happening in New York City, the update that I've got for New York City is that it's becoming exceptionally grim. You know, we've talked about this failure to flatten the curve and how that's kind of playing out over time. And it's been abstract. It's been numbers. Folks like Johnny can say, don't believe the numbers, don't believe the numbers. But now as we get to New York City, what we're starting to see is the material state, the system state, representing those abstract numbers in a very, very real way. And I want you to think of a pipeline that involves dead bodies. A person dies in a hospital, they get taken to a morgue, the morgue takes them to the funeral center either sends them to the graveyard or the crematorium. What we're seeing now in New York City is the pipeline beginning to fill out from the end backwards. We now have reports that they're running out of room in the crematoriums. They're not able to process funerals in the graveyards efficiently. The bodies are stacking up and they're coming back up through the system to the funeral directors. They're asking for relief. They're asking for refrigerator trucks, mobile crematoriums. This is because they can't keep up with the rate of dead bodies. Remember, there's been 3,000 dead in New York. A lot of those have happened in the last week. We're now at a doubling of the death rate in New York City. And as this backs up in the system, the inability to deal with it sort of more out of the way, out of the visual way, means those bodies are going to move back up, and we're going to start seeing them outside of hospitals being loaded into trucks. We're going to start seeing them in the hospitals and in homes, because the ability to process the dead is going to be very, very limited relative to the amount of people that are dying. And I wanted to share with you, let's see here, I'll share the projection. And Johnny, you may want to avoid this part because it is a calculation that involves numbers. But here, let's move this. Where did it go? Here we go. I've got to load the. All right, so what we're looking at now is all right, so this is New York, right? And this is the projection of New York. And this is when we look at failure to flatten the curve. This is, and it's in the links in here, this is the health data projection. They're using the same rough numbers to calculate cases. And what they've done is they've calculated how many beds are available, how many ICU beds they have, how many intensive ventilators they have, and how much are needed. And then they go through and look, as we begin to exceed that level, we begin increasing the deaths per day. So you can begin to see here the rise in deaths per day. And this is tracking reports. So this has actually been fairly accurate. But you get into this range here where they're forecasting, and you see here it peaks at about, on April 10th, it's going to peak at about 855 deaths a day. Now there's a range. It could be between 524 and 1,000. This is just in New York. When you're talking about nearly 900 or 1,000 deaths a day, the ability of the city to handle those bodies is not going to be able to keep pace. And you're going to see the material. This will no longer be an abstract number. It'll be very, very real, because you're going to be able to see this effect. You'll see it on social media, you'll see it on video, you'll see it on amateur, you'll see it on all the different parts from all the different angles, that it's not just some person with a spreadsheet making up numbers because of bad news. It's a very clear effect. And the trick is New York's not alone. New York's the worst case scenario, in that what we have in New York is a very, very large city that, okay, Johnny, so yeah, Johnny, I don't think you actually know what you're talking about here. You're saying it's absolutely not true. It's the same as the flu. Hold that thought. We're going to get to it. Testing will begin here for antibodies on Monday on the list this week. You know what, Johnny? Go out and be fine. Don't worry about it. Just go out and be fine. And if you're right, I'll wear a chicken suit and sing on the internet. April 15th, Johnny, I want you to contact me and tell me, and we'll verify whether or not any of these deaths are real. So if you're willing to do that, Johnny, if you're willing to wear a chicken suit on the internet and sing glad tidings, I'm willing to do it if these deaths aren't real. You tell me if you're willing to do it if the deaths are real. In the meantime, pause your comments of just saying it's not there, because you're not really providing any evidence other than, it's not real. By the way, the flu thing, we asked about this. So picking up the ball, I did this once before. I already answered it, John. The whole thing about the flu thing is, yes, flus happen every year, but that's like saying traffic accidents happen in a freeway. And a freeway has a set amount of traffic that's on it. This is adding a whole additional set of traffic on top of that and removing the safety measures because we don't have the vaccines and treatments. So it's true that heart disease kills people every year. Flu kills people every year. But the problem with that analogy is we have mechanisms to mitigate that when people get sick or to prevent it from happening in the first place. And with the novel virus, we don't have those mechanisms. So these are now a volume of patients on top of existing patients. And that's why the system gets overloaded. If this was spread out over a year, it might not be a big thing. These 100 to 200,000 deaths are happening in the month of April. That's the challenge. It's not that if it was spread out over 12 months, these hospitals wouldn't get overwhelmed, Johnny. It's that it's happening in a very short time. And when I say New York's the worst case scenario, what I mean is that this tsunami is going to be happening everywhere. And this is why states and localities need to prepare. And again, if you prepare, when you're doing crisis management, you have two options. You can prepare for something that is reversible, where the harm for preparation is reversible and can be mitigated. If you prepare as if it's going to be a bad situation and it's not, okay, good. You can reverse the harm of that. But if you fail to prepare as if it were going to be a bad situation, you can't catch up. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these southern states, is a failure to at least hedge the bets. They've sort of made the commitment that we're going to continue. And if it's not the absolute best case that we think it is, there's very little chance to recover for it. Because here's what's happening with New York City. New York City is so large, they have so many cases that they are now drawing all available resources into that area. PPE, hospital trucks, mobilization trucks, available healthcare workers. They're being drawn into New York City because we can see this is going to happen in the next week or so. So everyone's rushing into there. Those resources will not be available or will be at degraded states when this begins hitting elsewhere. And it's not a morality play of what's right and what's wrong. It's not getting into saying, well, New York doesn't deserve it because some other place deserves it, or some other place should give it up because it's not happening yet. The reality is this is like a gathering tsunami. The water's gonna rise everywhere. And you're further out on the beach, it's gonna knock you out. If you're a little bit in on the beach, it's still gonna knock you out. If you didn't start moving to higher ground early, you're going to be in really bad shape. The problem arises when governors and things like this start using force to allocate these scarce resources. And that's what we're seeing in New York. And Governor Cuomo came out and said, I am going to force hospitals that have excess ventilators to begin providing them into New York City. And this is within the state, but he's asking for it to happen around the country. The problem with that is it sort of, if you look at the details, he says, and we will return them to you, or we will compensate you with money if we're not able to return them to you. Well, that's not going to help people if these are limited procurement opportunities. And so there's a real risk that we will see resources and available buffer go into New York City, get consumed, and not be available in the more rural areas or other cities as this rolling wave. This is why I've been saying for 2 weeks, we need to have a coordinated voluntary national response where people begin working together, voluntary agreements, not the use of force, but voluntary agreements across state lines to work out these protocols. How do we share resources? When doctors move into New York, they're going to become exposed, they're going to become sick, and they're going to become exhausted. If we're asking those same doctors to just shift back, how do they get replaced on the line? Who replaces them? How do we go about restoring them or giving them a break so that they can recover? Otherwise, we're just trading deaths in one location to deaths in another location. And that's the real challenge of this, because there is no national response at the national level. I mean, President Trump, for lack of a better word, has just, I hate to say it, but he's just been a complete coward about this. The CDC came out with guidance that says you should wear masks. And his view is, well,
Wear a mask if you want to, wear a mask if you don't. He doesn't even have the conviction to pick a choice. Same thing with these governors. He's not declaring a national emergency and organizing a response, because if he does and it's wrong, it's his blame. He'd rather have the governors to be in a position where he can tell the governors, hey, this is your fault or you did it wrong, because that keeps the blame off him. And I understand it. This is within keeping of his MO. This isn't unusual. It's been around for a while, but it's starting to create real problems because these state by state solutions, it's kind of like when you go to free trade and start breaking down free trade agreements. If we get protectionism in place in states that say, you can't use my resources, you can't use my ventilators. We've already seen that protectionism on a national, international stage where there's a concern that they're going to, or an actual order that 3M cannot now ship ventilators to Canada because those ventilators have to stay in the United States. People forget these decisions are made at a point in time without an awareness of the system and the feedback effects. I guarantee you there are subcomponents made in Canada that we're going to need to come here to help us with our technical supply, just like there are things we need from other countries. We are in a trading system, and if we start enforcing barriers that say, you can't get our finished goods, other countries may say, fine, you don't get our subcomponent goods, and then the whole thing breaks down in a healthcare way, very similar to the free trade protection of the Smith-Hawley Act in the sort of that exacerbated the Great Depression. As soon as countries start enforcing these mutual barriers and sort of nationalist, our resources only here, the global supply that makes all these things possible shuts down. And granted, we could replace it. There could be a period of time where we could develop local capabilities, but we only have through the month of April and mid-May to get this all going. So it's not really a good idea. And this isn't just Trump. It's I fault Governor Cuomo for the same thing. This forceful policy of mandating people to, or mandating ventilators has a similar effect. People are not going to want to share them. What we need are incentives, some sort of incentive mechanism to encourage the sharing, but also a plan of how these resources get shared back out. Now, Governor Cuomo was right in one way. These crises are going to hit places at different times. And because of that, it's going to be, you're going to see a rolling effect where, New York City is getting hit heavily. As New York City wanes, somewhere in Louisiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, these other ones are going to happen. So there is an opportunity to actually play, and I've talked about this flattening the curve from a geography standpoint. You can distribute across a distributed network and limit the impact of this if you can move around and play those timing windows. But it takes cooperation. It doesn't take one side telling another, this is the way it's going to be, and that's the only way it's going to be. So, I mean, and kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on here before we get to the Q&A is this does lead to this kind of pandemic works program that I mentioned in the topic. We have a lot of people that are currently unemployed, and we need resources as we move through these waves. And it's the problem is we can't just, first of all, the standard public works program are generally less effective. Having someone dig a ditch when you don't need a ditch is 100% ineffective for the long term. It keeps someone employed for that period, but it provides no multiple. However, in a pandemic, we need resources of preparing hospitals, helping out, recovering areas. We have a large workforce that could be mobilized in this to help out manufacturing, to help out other areas. The problem, it needs to be incentive-based and not force-based. And that means there needs to be incentives for people to move, and it needs to be safe for them to move. The biggest incentive is the knowledge of safety. Everyone's self-isolating now, everyone's quarantining, that's good. But at some point, we need to have a capability wherein volunteers can organize and help. And I know this is happening in the healthcare industry, that you're retired, you're no longer working in healthcare, they're volunteering in. But this, as I said, this is the tsunami that's going to suck in all the resources. They're going to need more help. So what does this pandemic works program looks like? It looks like preparing hospitals, supporting surveillance testing efforts, getting people trained good enough to do the job and not put themselves at risk, and then using them in areas where we know the risk is low. We may not be able to send these folks in front line. That would probably be unwise. But as these crests and wave, they can come in and support after the wave crests, as the other trained professionals move to the next spot on the wave. And this is all about mobilizing a force, which I'll get into this more in some of the future forecasts, to relieve the exhaustion, right? You can't have the same group of people move around and expect them to maintain readiness. I mean, I work with the military all the time. Military rotates people off the line. They have regular rotations. This concept of readiness, we're going to have to use for the healthcare. And again, it's got to be a voluntary national mobilization to bring hands and feet, not just for this wave, but if there is a wave 2 later in the summer or more likely in the fall, we need to put these procedures in place, because we're probably not going to get it right the first time, but we need to be effective at this so we can get it right in future times. So let me go check to see what questions there are. All right, so are there... All right, guys, be nice in the comments or I'll start banning people. Johnny, we are not using false positives, all right? We are not using testing. We are using dead bodies to calculate our infected. If you think there's a false dead body, I'd love to see that study. Please put the study in the link that says it's a false dead body. Do I have the patience of a saint? No, but I have Bonky here, and Bonky is providing it. Jason, good to see you. Oh, Johnny, a Chinese doctor published it. You would have to, yeah, Johnny, until you can post a citation. Are the current mortality, so here's a question from Rory. Let's drinking heavily and demanding the spotlight. So let's give Rory some time while Johnny finishes his first night drinking and enjoys the first night of alcohol. Rory, are the current mortality rates assuming 100% of infected will have adequate medical care? Will mortality rates increase with the unavailable life-saving treatment? So this is something that we've seen happen in Spain and Italy. And these death rates can be confusing because there's a lot of underlying factors. There's demographics, different circumstances, but the two major drivers of a death rate is one, the failure of the hospital to be able to support it, to flatten the curve. And two, this factor of when you bias the testing sample and you start restricting who you're testing to people who are known to be sick, they're showing up for hospital treatment, they're already being hospitalized, it's an already deceased body, you're gonna have that positive rate increase, as I showed, above the 10%. And what that means is you're finding your overall population size of confirmed cases is not growing, even as your death count does. And if you're doing a death rate, it's deaths divided into, or deaths divided into confirm, you're going to have an accelerating death rate. So the two things with the death rates are, one, healthcare systems collapse, like in Italy, Spain, France is starting to see it, New York City starting to see it. That contributes one element. And then this factor of the declining ability to test means that we have an ever smaller population we're dividing those deaths into. I think those two are the primary reasons that create a declining or accelerating death rate. Yeah. I'm seeing, by the way, Muleteers, thanks for handling Johnny. I see he's being well handled there. Beth, FEMA just took 500 ventilators from Colorado's order. This is the type of problem I'm talking about, where this division, and states were bidding against each other for ventilators. Now nations are bidding against each other for ventilators. Now orders are taking ventilators from one group to another group. And this creates a real risk of division. Imagine what happens if upstate New York gets ventilators taken by New York City, and then they're not returned and deaths resulted because of it. Now, deaths, in my opinion, would have resulted anyway. All of these places are going to have the failure, the flattening curve. But now you have a legitimate grievance that we had ventilators. You took them by force. You didn't give them back and people died. This may not just be New York City and New York rural area. This could be northern states and southern states. It could be rural areas and city areas, these urbans. All of these divisions come into play when we start using force if we can't restore it whole. I mean, if we restore things whole or more so, that's great. If we took 10 ventilators and returned 10 plus 5 we don't need now because we passed that curve, that works out well. I don't have the faith in government, especially after this level of crisis, to be able to execute that kind of logistics given what they've just gone through. I think New York City is going to be recovering for this from a very long time and prioritizing the return, simply the location. Where do these ventilators go? Who has them? Which ones are the ones that were actually borrowed? So I'm returning the right ones. I mean, I was there in the DOD when we had to turn in Blackberries on one day because the government shut down. And I can't tell you how much of that a mess it was. And that was just DOD workers, right? So this sort of logistics of trading and sharing, these protocols need to be worked out. And New York City, again, it's the worst case because it's drawing all these resources in, but it gives us a chance to actually learn from this and get better for the rest of the country, but only if the rest of the country starts taking this seriously and coordinating. Yeah, and Will Sample brings up a really good point. Will Sample brings up that the Federal Reserves, the federal stockpiles, are empty or near empty. And that means they've been drawn down. So there was, like most federal stockpiles, there was a large amount of it that was, probably degraded, decrepit, not useful anymore. Because these early states were large, they consumed a lot of the federal stockpile. It was drawn down. It's going to take a while to restore it. And now states are having to assume that there is no fallback on this stockpile. It's like the strategic oil reserves. In this case, it was the strategic PPE reserves, right? There's supposed to be a certain level of PPE, but a couple things happen. First of all, in the H1N1, we used a lot of it in the H1N1 pandemic, but we didn't restore it afterwards. And so that's a failure, the failure to restore to previous levels. The amount we did have wasn't maintained well, and some of it now is not useful. Then this virus hits in the biggest cities it possibly can, in the biggest population areas first. They draw what's left. I mean, there's only so many hospital ships that can move around, and we've already got 2 of them up in New York City. So all of these resource questions are part of what's going to contribute to a very, very difficult April. Mike, good to see you. Hands and feet, where did this come from somewhere? Hands and feet, Mike Morrison, hands and feet are bodies, people to do stuff, right? You need extra hands and feet. So you need to convert buildings into ICU wards. You need to, not the huge technical thing of the wiring, but just cleaning out the material, cleaning out the furniture, things that you can train people to do relatively easy. They're relatively low risk, and you're going to need a lot of people to do it. Surveillance testing. Surveillance testing is like, it's like opinion polling, but you need people to do opinion polling, and you need people to call up, and administer at least these phone-based interviews. And then you have to have teams that are willing to go out and follow up with actual tests. This is how you get an understanding of where this is in the country, because as this wildfire line moves through us, right, and we pass it, there's still going to be hot spots all around that we have to know where those hot spots are. These are called reservoirs, and these reservoirs can act as second wave points. A prison system, for example, might have an ongoing outbreak or a lot of infected, but because of their demographics, there's not many deaths. There's a lot of asymptomatics. We don't know that reservoir is there. We relax the wave 1. We drop all the social quarantine and isolation, and all of a sudden we get hit right again. We're seeing this in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has had a spike in cases because they dropped their isolation and quarantine procedures, but there were pockets of these reservoirs. So hands and feet, people to go out to surveillance test. Ideally, once we know they have antibodies. We're working on tests right now to see what the antibodies are. I think Oxford in England is doing a large one. If it turns out their tip of the iceberg theory is correct, and we all have gotten this, and we're all now have antibodies, that's a really good news, because these hands and feet can be supplied by people who have antibodies. Get them a little card, little ID, they can go out and help with the recovery and know that they're safer than someone who has not been exposed. And that allows us to get to herd immunity as well. Oh, David is asserting that Bonky does not have a knee. So David, the origin stories of Bonky, the emotional support donkey, are shrouded in mystery. It's going to come out as its own MCU installment, MCU 7, 8, 9, something like that. But because Donkey has a knee, Bonky has a knee, we think. The origin story may have a plot twist, though. There's an alleged rumor, Valeria says, that filter paper 3M uses in Canadian in the first place, but I want to properly source. What sort of documentation can one easily find for where manufacturing of bits and pieces come from and how best to look? This is a good question, Valeria. Global supply chain networks are fiendishly complex right now. I've lived in this world for a while. I do a lot of process improvement in supply chain. I think like an iPhone gets built in something like 635 parts that come from several dozen countries. And the problem is it's shifting constantly. The sophisticated nature of the supply chain means every day or every week, we may be, if you're a supply chain manager, you may be resourcing these components. So it's kind of a moving target. And that's the challenge with resourcing. You can probably look into a specific company like 3M that builds these a lot and look at their vendor list and their supply list and begin, or if they have any reports on where their supplies come from, maybe a geographic map. But it's going to be very hard, I think, to trace back, unless you are a supply chain manager in the company, of where the specific supply chains run. This is one reason we need national data coordination, to have companies voluntarily share this information, to make aware and visible that we can't just go cutting off other countries to spite our nose, because it turns out that they have something we need, and we need to be not just cut it off. Christy asked, something that came up in a conversation yesterday makes more sense to the violence discussion. There's a comment with the EU's internet is barely keeping up with current demands. her local bandwidth in Florida is a bit taxed. What sort of ramifications? So this is about, do you okay, let's see. Okay, what are the ramifications of a utility has an outage that's longer than a few hours, so more than a couple hours? So Christy has a good question here. We're seeing certain utilities taxed, right? We know, so let's go with the worst case and say we have outages. We know countries that have regular rolling brownouts. Iraq is one that many hours a day. They're able to function. It's not exactly great, but they are able to function, and that's an electricity blackout. Here you would see people go blind from information because they don't have, social media and all that thing. So that would be a challenge, that our information that we're used to getting from, and we're supposed to stay isolated. However, that's the worst case scenario. I would think to say here, look at the seen and unseen. At the same time, we are taxing out some applications of utilities, especially on the internet, as the workforce moves from home and we don't have these servers. We are relieving pressure from other industrial machinery that's not being used, restaurants and retailers. If you look at the distribution of power, residential is the most, because we have the most people. So if you look at a power grid, residential use, especially as we go into hotter months where you're getting air conditioning, stuff like that, that's a lot. But taking offline during these quarantine procedures, some of that commercial and industrial usage will help offset that, at least for electricity and maybe things like water. When it comes to the internet, that's a scaling question of how much these servers and these cloud servers really can keep up with that increased demand. And I don't know a good answer of whether, an enterprise level Fortune 500 company with everyone working in office using very sophisticated computer programs, server-based programs, now shifted remote and probably using a more limited function, but they're now doing it all over the internet. I don't know which generates more load capacity for the overall load. And I have a feeling it's going to be very hub specific. So if it's going to be carrier specific and hub specific to where these brownouts go. But the key thing is, when you have a situation like that, normally the areas around it can support and bring in. So if there's a water shortage in one area, we're going to have this, you have people bring in water from other areas. That's happened in the US before. We can deal with it. Even generators. I mean, you talk about power outages. Look at a hurricane, for example, where you may have a week of power outages or a bad tornado. People can bring in generators. It's not ideal. I was down when the tornado hit, wiped out power for a long time. You saw these massive generators come online. The challenge with the pandemic, and this is where we really need to start thinking about how we react to these after wave one, is how do we coordinate this movement of resources into an area that may still be contagious? I raised the issue, I think, on Wednesday. What happens if there's a Cat 5 hurricane coming to a highly populated area in Florida while there's an outbreak going on? Do you evacuate the area and send everyone on the roads north to Georgia and therefore miss the hurricane, but perhaps spread a contagion or make it worse? Or do you have everyone shelter in place with quarantine and social isolation, but now they're at risk for the hurricane? That, to a lesser extent, is going to be the same problem if we have these outages occur. I haven't seen any information that they're likely to occur yet. I'm going to look into that and see if I can give an update. Yeah, so Jody is stating here, general decentralization, 5G is the answer to all. Yeah. So a person I will not name, whose name rhymes with Psych Sorensen, gave me a list of internet rumors to rebuttal, but we had Johnny show up, who graciously of his time provided more to rebut. But I want to go through some of these, and they come from Zero Hedge. And if you've not read Zero Hedge, you can go read Zero Hedge if you want. And it's this kind of, a lot of these sites, one of the things about a bad rumor, and this could be bad on either side, either COVID denialism or, paranoia, this excessive paranoia. The key way to see this, and Johnny was a good example, is they present a fallacy, a choice of fallacy, a binary fallacy. Either we're way overreacting or we should do nothing at all. And when it comes to crisis management and sort of pragmatic policy setting, there's a lot of middle ground in between there, where there's room for valid concern that we can't just, stop doing everything, but likewise, we can't ignore this. So you're trying to find that middle ground, and it's less about absolute good and bad and more about trade-off risks. So one of the things looking at this article, this Zero Hedge article, is it presents everything as a binary choice. The only way to enforce social distancing and quarantine is to have neighbors call and report on each other, and that's bad. Well, there's a gradient there where a little bit of social shaming might be okay. Going to having SWAT teams coming down on someone, that's not good. I mean, we see cases now in Spain, and I think Spain was one, and I'm trying to remember those, where police are beating people for being out after quarantine. That's not a good response. We can agree that excessive police force in response to quarantine is a bad reaction. It's too far, but that doesn't mean that we should just not have social isolation and self-isolation and just hope it passes. So one of the things with these rumors is always look to see if they're trying to present an either or and a binary choice, or if they've properly segmented a series of gradients and said, within this middle ground, there's some valid room for debate, and either of these extremes are bad. There's another one in here that I want to trust that says, do not trust a single of the numbers being reported about the outbreak. And it has the classic lies and statistics and damn lies. So here's the thing. Statistics don't really help you much in this sort of circumstance. A lot of people think I do statistics. I don't. I use calculus. So right off the bat, they got the wrong kind of math. Statistics is about finding out the unknown things of a population and sort of inferring from that what the overall characteristics of the population are. So it's sort of like if you're filling a bathtub and you see the tub rising, you sort of, you can kind of statistically say, well, how much does it need to have? Calculus is about measuring things. This is why we use calculus for physics, right? We use calculus to understand how the world causally works. And from that, we then go and simulate population. So it's taking two sides of the coin. With statistics, we start with a large population and take a sample and try and infer characteristics from the large. And that creates errors of all sorts. With calculus, we start with simple procedures and grow those in a generative way, often by simulation, and then see how that grows into the full population. Both of them have their pluses and minuses, but saying, just don't believe the numbers is kind of, again, hedge your bets, right? If we're wrong, we can mitigate the harm we've done. There are means to mitigate economic harm, disruption. We can mitigate those harms if this has all been wrong. And so far, most of my forecasts of the policymakers has been correct. Trump's backed off the lifting of the social quarantine in mid-April. People who are even adamantly opposed to this are beginning to realize you need to start doing something. But if we're wrong, it's reversible and mitigatable. But in this circumstance, if you choose not to do anything and you are wrong, it's not reversible or not mitigatable. And that's the challenge when you're looking at these type 1 and type 2 errors or false positives or things like that, is there's sort of a false sense of security and precision. I know that 80% are false positive. Well, okay, one guy in China, Johnny, said that, and you're convinced now. Okay, you're taking a huge gamble that I don't think you take. If one person on the planet said that person at the end of the bar you're looking at right now through beer goggles is your future spouse and you're meant to be, you probably would want to maybe get some second opinions. You'd want to sort of, get a consensus. And that's how science works, is we don't take just one viewpoint on it. We try and get a consensus around it, because when you're dealing with complex systems, you can rarely get precision. You can rarely say. What you try and get is an accurate causal understanding of what's happening. And let's see here. Other questions. All models. Yeah, Mike Morrison. Thank you, Mike. It's a great point. All models are wrong, some are useful. This is George Box's quote, and it's really important to understand that when people find that there are errors in model, it's because if we could model the real world, we'd just use the real world. But the real world is insanely complex, and unlike an experiment, a scientific experiment, you can isolate the experiment, you can control everything that interacts in a simple chemical reaction, and then you can replicate it under the exact same conditions. When we're talking about complex systems, we can't ever take Italy 4 weeks ago, isolate it, get everything the same as it was on March 1st, and then run a contrary experiment for an alternate Italy that says what would have happened had they done something different. This inability to replicate is probably one of the biggest challenges with complex systems management, in that the traditional scientific method we're sort of trained in high school and early level college starts to break down because we don't have the sort of validity we have through experiments. That's why we talk about confidence more than validity. Confidence is using the right procedures, following the right methods, having the right disclosures. There's a whole suite of confidence measures we build, but still with all that, all models will be wrong. The question is that model useful to make a decision? And I apologize for the halo effect. It's kind of coming in from the sun that's coming in from the side window. So hopefully if you're not Johnny, that's not a drinking effect. That's just the sun coming in. Yeah, Christy, I'm actually very bad at statistics and very bad at algebra, I use calculus, and a lot of times I let the computer do the calculus for me. So Christy's asking that, you know, how I do this all. So my background and training is actually in system dynamics. So what we use is we create computer simulations using calculus, a little bit of statistics, some geometry, some algebra mixed together, but it's the computer doing the work. The model I built for ISIS in Syria and Iraq has 800 equations and 65 simultaneous differential equations, right? I'm not doing that in my head. I'm not doing that by hand. I'm letting the computer work it. But calculus is a very different kind of mathematics than statistics. And I think it's actually a lot easier conceptually. And it's the kind of math you really need in these sort of viral outbreaks, because it deals with changes over time, dynamics within time, nonlinear behavior. All of these things are best understood by calculus. Like, not to get super wonky, but one of the challenges is you see these patterns that are oscillations, like a growth rate, and it goes up and down. If you're sampling in a survey at different points on those curves, you're going to see a correlation at times that show positive correlation, strong positive. But if it's going on the downward, two linked variables are both showing a decline at time, you can show a negative, or excuse me, they're offset, you may show a negative correlation. And then at some points in the transition, you may show no or weak correlation. So the same behavior mode actually can generate, depending on when your sample, if your sample window is too narrow or isn't inclusive enough, it can generate different correlations based off the time you took the sample. But if you can generate that wave sign with calculus, you can see, oh, this is an oscillating behavior. And the simple answer to that example of that is population of rabbits and foxes, right? Foxes eat rabbits. If there aren't enough foxes, rabbits' birth goes up. And as rabbits go up, foxes go up. If you took a sample there, positive correlation, rabbits to foxes. But at some point, there's enough foxes that begin eating rabbits, the rabbit population declines, even as foxes are still going up. At that point, if you took a sample there, it would show negative correlation. And if you hit one of those transition points, it would show weak correlation. So you see these in the natural world all the time that make it, it's sort of called noisy data. And I'm working with terrorism and violence and instability, lots of noisy data, but I don't want to get too far into that because I'll lose everyone. How do I get the +1? Oh, yeah, Mike, Top Fan +1 is a super secret elusive fan badge that only comes from, if you don't have clearance at Ultra Rainbow level, I'm not allowed to talk about it. So any other questions that are out there? I know we're at the top of the hour. I want to make sure I've covered all the questions. We had a little bit of distraction there, but I think we got through it. How useful are, okay, revisiting my earlier question, Will asks, how useful are hospitalization and ventilation rates when examining the growth of a state's problems before the state medical systems are at a saturation point? So what Will's talking about is what I call proxy measures, right? A lot of times in systems, studying systems, we can't measure the thing very well. And I call it the Rumsfeld problem. When this virus hit, we had the data reporting we had and the sophisticated simulation models. If we had it at the time it started, that's what we're using. I had an option a month ago to start building a simulation model of this. And I realized if I didn't already have a robust, well-sourced, highly confident, peer-reviewed model in hand, I would not get one done in the time for it to be useful. And so this is the same with data. Everyone's throwing out, well, we could use these measures. And my challenge is all, show me the data source that's reporting using a consistent method and a consistent way and is viable across the number of jurisdictions you want to measure. You want to measure states, then every state has to report it. You want to measure counties, every counties. So in the absence of this kind of rigorous data, we use proxy measures. And a proxy measures in a systems thinking one is you're thinking about n order effects from what you're looking at. What we actually want to know is the number of infected in the system state. That's the magic 8 question everyone's trying to answer. Well, one order effect, one order removed is confirmed tests, right? That's a first order removed from the actual infected. We know it's not the actual number, but it's one order removed. But we also know some of those infected are going to get sick and go into hospitalizations. That now becomes a second order removed measure. And you can start using second, third, fourth, fifth order removed measures as proxy measures to get closer to that simulation. I mean, when I was studying ISIS in Syria and Iraq, no one knew how long it took to train an ISIS member when they came in from a foreign recruit to when they were able to deploy on the field. I was able to use second order measures of how many foreign recruits were coming in and how they were faring in battle and reverse engineer a close enough approximation. So these proxy measures, Will, I think are useful, but you have to put them in context of it's not perfect, but it's probably good enough. And what you're going to see is the rising, look at the trend lines. Again, dynamics over time. Don't take it as a point in time at a single day. A lot of these media resources are reporting a number at a point in time. Look for something that looks like a trend line. And what you're looking for is a rising trend line, and it may be rising in oscillations, but it doesn't sharply decline. It doesn't say decline. If it's a rising trend lines don't just go to zero for nothing. They tend to rise, crest, and then decline. And that can be very sharp if it's a rise and collapse, or it can be very gradual. But if you're seeing a rising trend line in some of these proxy measures, that's a good indication of where the system was at some time ago. That's the second problem with using these proxy measures, is not just finding them and making sure you're interpreting them correctly, but understanding the time delay. A person hits the hospital usually 5, 6, 7, 10 days after they get infected. So what you're looking at is a second order measure 10 days removed from the actual infected at a point in time in history. And that's where it gets tricky of then how do you take that estimate of where we were in the past and bring it forward, not just to today, but into the future. And that's where calculus comes in very handy, or you can just sort of mentally project. And this peaking thing with this doubling effect, what's confusing a lot of people is, let's say New York City reported 100,000 confirmed infections a day. We know that number's low, but let's just take it as it is. When you're doubling every few days, right, that means over half your cases are in that time window where they're not going to be showing up as a hospital measure. So if you were looking at hospital rates in New York City, Will, what you're seeing today is the reflection of the infections probably 10 days to 5 days ago. You're not seeing this massive increase of infections recently, although there is a complication here that as they begin testing more and more in the hospitals, you're getting a more accurate read of what's in the hospitals, but now you're losing awareness for the greater. So there's a lot of things with these proxy measures you need to be careful of, but they may be the best we have right now. Okay, Christy's asking specifically the ramifications of internet being down given city region. So medical communication, Internet of Thing items could not communicate feedback regarding testing, and people are scared, no longer have access to things that keep them somewhat mollified, entertained, and educated. So Christy's asking, is there a healthcare or instability impact of the internet going down? And healthcare is somewhat outside my league, so I want to put a pin in that until I can look into it more. Certainly, Internet of Things, this is like Alexa for doctors, right? You know, the version of we have all these instrumentation, we have all these hospital fancy sophisticated machines. If I'm putting on my systems thinking hat and getting a little bit on thin ice because I don't know healthcare, I'm going to guess that losing the internet is probably not hugely impactful for the mortality rate or the outcome rate, simply because we don't have any treatments. So the fancy records and method systems are often tied to our sophisticated ability to treat known diseases. As this is unknown, it's kind of the treatments are sort of known. Ventilators, intubation, you know, there's some treatments that you can do with drugs and stuff like that. That can all be administered without the internet being active. What's going to challenge is the information flow. So information flow in this stance would hit on supply and resupply. A lot of our information of I need more of this thing can no longer be described in human terms because it's so complex and so large that we use computers to try and track how much we need an inventory system. So the challenge, I think, of the internet going down would be a resupply. However, I think that's being looked at because of this supply issue. They're sort of rushing all the supplies, at least in New York City. Hopefully I didn't just pause and we're still recording here. And then the instability aspect, I'm going to assume we're still recording, even though mine's kind of frozen. Hopefully you're all hearing this. The instability aspect is that when the internet goes down, you lose this education. Most people are not going to want to immediately take to the streets and start, you know, there's a risk factor to them. They know that as the internet goes down, the communication goes down. Most people have sort of a shelter in place mentality when that happens. You may start to see neighborhood communities. So when we see this in cities that are failing states, we start to see a lot of neighborhood efforts build up, even at the block level, local blocks of neighbors getting together and sort of forming watch parties. So there's sort of a natural human response to devolve to more of a tribal or kin network. And in this case, your immediate geographic neighborhood is your kin neck, for lack of a better word. We saw this in the Arab Spring in Egypt and some of the cities where as the systems of the state began to fail, people replaced them with local area systems for protection and things like that. We see these in civil war regions like in Iraq. We even see them in places like Kiev during the Euromaidan uprising, where local sort of networks and watch communities, and that local effect where it exists tends to damp down on instability, because people who go out for a joyride and sort of maybe want to do a little rioting or something like that, they see that it's kind of, there's checkpoints up, there's people not letting them in neighborhoods. It can be very concerning, obviously, if you're a vulnerable population or a person of color and you run into this and you're like, what's going on? But they tend to damp the instability. Now, if it's over weeks, there's a theory, and this came in Katrina: how many days can modern society go when it's completely cut off from a crucial commodity? Oil, gasoline, electricity. And the general theory is 5 to 7 days you begin seeing some kinds of instability. So if you have a situation where there's an outage with no relief, again, in hurricanes we see examples of limited areas going down for weeks at a time. Generators are brought in, there's a restoration. But if you see widespread outages for more than a week, that would probably be a pretty bad sign. I don't think that's going to happen, but let's see if it does. And of course, in the hospital, the biggest thing is that resupply issue. Let's see here. Going through any other questions I missed. Yeah, Mike's asking. I see. I can't see now who's responding to Johnny or who's. What is the R-aught? There's a couple questions here of R-aught of COVID-19. Read a paper last week, so there's a bunch of questions in there about R-aught. I'll try and handle them all at once now. What R-aught is, for folks who don't know, is it's R sub 0. It is a measure of the infectability of disease, and R1 means that for each person who's infected, they're going to infect one more person. And you can begin to think of it as the amount of contagion spread that a certain virus will have. And R of 30 means for every one person who gets infected, you're going to spread it to 30. What's key to remember about these R-aughts rates is they themselves are dynamic over time. And this is the challenge, I think, where people are reporting like an R rate is fixed. If it was fixed and above 1, inevitably the entire population would always get sick. That doesn't happen. There are factors that affect these R rates. The reduction of susceptible population as they get sick and recover or die, the amount of distancing, the time it takes to be infected, the duration of recovery, that the length of time someone spend being infected that they can contribute. So if you measure an R period over time, you're going to get a dynamically moving number. And that's the challenge with these sampling windows that are looking at a point in time or a specific country. At the end of this, so when wave 1 is declared over, someone can go back and declare a net life cycle R value that says over the entire length of this in this town or this country or this world, the R rate was this. But throughout it, you're going to get very different results because they're going to be sampling under different conditions and different time windows. Yeah, David, you're not even going to get a top fan badge if you keep thinking Bonky doesn't have an E. Fan badges, so sprinkles are for winners. Fan badges are for those who recognize Bonky has an E. Lori, good to see you. Thanks from UK. Will's talking about looking on low-end infection rates and seeing how the areas of low infection presently are faring at not repeating the mistakes of a New York City. If hospitalization and ventilation rates, as well as positive test rates, are relatively flat or moving, it should reflect a general trend of the spread of infection, right? The challenge there, Will, is that the tide is going to look like it's out until it starts coming in. So if you're measuring a low flat, you actually want some movement. It would be more helpful if there was a rise in the use of the hospitalization and then a decline. So if you're trying to use these proxy second, third order measures, a consistently flat rate doesn't tell you much because it could be a timing effect that it's still coming in your area and building up. What I would put more confidence is if you see a rise and then a decline, that tells you that something has come in the area, it's happened, and we're declining out of it. I think in the, when you look at that chart I put up earlier, the COVID-19 projections, some states are, like New York's hitting its peak April 9th. Some states aren't hitting their peak till April 28th. So there's multiple weeks. And think about this. New York City was at 1,000 infections. It's at 100,000 right now confirmed. It was at 1,000 infections on March 9th, right? So you think about how fast this can move. And we are tracking New York at multiple hundreds of infections right now, actual. It doesn't take long for 1,000 infections to turn into 100,000 infections. And that's the risk of a doubling period in an outbreak and this sort of changing. Christine, good to see you. Lisa, good to see you. Thanks, everyone. Oh, by the way, I'm terrible at this. If you like this information, please support the Infomullet on Patreon, or tell your friends to support. Most of you are supporters. I appreciate that. But ask your friends to support, and even Johnny. Johnny, if you want to support us, we will let you support us as a mulleteer if you're still here and not passed out yet from the drinking that was heavy when you were presenting that argument. Sorry, Johnny, you just picked up the ball. So I think we're covering most of the questions. So www.patreon.com/infomullet. That's the Patreon page. I did a Twitch game with Maria on Go last night. We are doing Mullet Go now. We've got most of the bugs worked out. So we're going to be playing Go. It's all social. It's very casual. It's not, there's no COVID discussion or very limited COVID discussion. It's meant to be a relaxing fun. And so people can watch in, learn some Go, hear some good conversation. We'll be doing that more often. And I'll be doing an education game on Go tomorrow at about 1:15 p.m. EST on Twitch. So let's see if there's any more questions. We're at about at the top of the hour, so it's a good time. Let's see. Yeah, the glare was not religious. As you can see, it's already faded, but maybe it was, well, maybe it was religious. Maybe it was +5 holy circumstance bonus when dealing with Johnny. Let's see, Johnny went to take a nap. So repeating oscillations at relatively shallow peaks would be ideal. Yeah, Will, this is getting into sophisticated. So studying oscillations is a big part of systems thinking and system dynamics, and you learn how to look at an oscillation and actually break it apart. So when you look at an oscillation, and let me find one here that I can use as an example. So let's do a quick reading oscillations. Okay, so here's and let's take all but one off. Let's see, Florida. Michigan's the one that's got. Okay, so here is, let's take a simple oscillation and learn how to read an oscillation together, right? So actually, all right, so I don't like those big checks. All right, we'll use Louisiana, or we can actually use Arkansas. Let's see what Arkansas says, since Will's from Arkansas. All right, so here's Arkansas. And again, this is an old chart with a rate of change, so don't take this as actual for Arkansas. These are the charts we pulled. But what you're seeing here is, if you think about this as an oscillatory trend, we actually break these up into segments in systems thinking and deal with the segments in discrete periods. So actually, between 12 days and 20 days, you have a rise and collapse that itself has an oscillation within it. So you've got a up and down pattern that itself has a small oscillation, and then you have a decline pattern with another oscillation in it. But if we take, say, Louisiana, Michigan, there, where was the one? Oh, Illinois, that was it. There we go. So you can begin to see here, these ones here, this decline pattern, you can actually have multiple oscillations within a pattern. And we actually call it slicing a problem. We start taking out these oscillations. So a daily oscillation, a small oscillation, could be a daily testing procedure. We test every other day, or we run out of testing every day. We report every day. It could be circumstance. You're not going to see a regular repeating if it's like in Albany, where there was one circumstance, the funerals that had the cookout that had a large bit. You wouldn't see a sustained oscillation, but a gradual decline with a sustained oscillation. That gradual decline tells you over time, despite whatever that daily reporting factor is, things are still declining over time. So I wouldn't look at a lot of small oscillations. I would look for a gradual or sharp increase followed by a gradual decline. And that will tell you there's sort of a cresting came in. Try and ignore the little jiggles that make noise in between it. Look for the big movement behavior patterns, because what you want to look for is one that goes up and comes down, and that's daily. If you're looking at cumulative infections, you want to see an S curve. And an S curve, when it flattens out, means that you've hit that rate of change, which has dropped down to under 5% from a growth standpoint. Yeah, my RPG nerddom is showing. Yeah, I think that's fun. We're fine with that. RPG nerddom, all good. A flatline 0 would be ideal. So, yeah, I think I've answered that. Mike was asking of the flatline 0. The flatline 0, again, Good to see you, Jay. The flat line 0 is, it's kind of like the tide's out. And as long as the tide's out, you don't know if it's out because it's out or anything has changed. You need to have that water come in and then see what happens. I mean, because another thing that can happen and remember, we're not actually standing at the beach reading this tide. Let's say you have a measurement system set up to look at the tide coming in and it's reading 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and all around you, the tide is coming in, but your data sensor still reads 0. That could be a calibration error. That could be a misreporting error. That could be a signal error. There's a whole bunch when we deal with the system state and the information flows coming out of it. There's a lot of room for errors and discrepancies because we can't physically see the act. I mean, it would be easy if we could walk out the door and look at the tide, right? That's how we're biologically programmed. But with these things like infections, not only can we really see someone who's infected unless they're very symptomatic, we can't possibly go in enough places to view even a small state by population. So I think we've pretty much hit the end of the questions. I'm going to give a few more questions again. www.patreon.com/infomullet. If you haven't become a Mulleteer subscriber, you can support the InfoMullet for $5 a month. Really appreciate it. It helps us keep our servers up and running, helps us get everything we do done. And we're trying to get as much information out to you as you can. We're going to do another one of these Ask Me Anythings on Wednesday, 1 p.m. EST. We'll have a Twitch Go game tomorrow at 1:15 p.m. EST. And unless there's more questions, I think we're done. But I haven't seen a question in a bit. So Bonky, would you like to say anything? Nope, Bonky appears to be good. So with that, we're going to say goodbye. Everyone have a good evening. Be safe, be well, be isolated, be quarantined. And if you're on the front lines, please take care of yourself. Be well, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.